from the Penn Libraries.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for coming out. And I really want to thank Kim for putting this together. This is really a great event. I also want to give a shout out to John for making the technology work. Thanks, and I'm glad you're right there. So it's really kind of, there's a little bit more pressure in presentations like this for, for the tech to work. So thanks, John. So you're probably looking at my slide and thinking, whoops, you got the title of the thing wrong. I did that on purpose. It's a little flipped around. We'll get to that in a second, though. So sometimes when I hear people talk about engaging students with technology, it seems like they're talking about using technology to get the attention of our students who are described as these digital natives. The descriptions make it sound like the students are totally different from older people like me in some really important and some really profound ways, particularly when it comes to their use of and comprehension of technology. Let's see, maybe that one? Cool. So this is the pitch that's the pitch I often hear from what I call the classroom technology industrial complex. If you work in IT on campus or the library on campus, you might be giggling to yourself about that idea that there are all of these companies constantly trying to sell us new ways to connect to students. And in case you can't tell, I don't like this pitch at all. Directly or indirectly, it tends to position our students and their purportedly short attention spans as the problem. And then they offer us very expensive solutions to that problem. So I want to flip this around a little bit and talk about not engaging students with technology, but engaging technology with our students. The way I see it, an emerging role for educators, and that includes librarians, is to help students develop the skills to thoughtfully engage with technology, to help them learn to use technology effectively, safely, and ethically, but also to learn how to critique technology and to critique the people who use it in ways that are sloppy or harmful or deceptive. So what I'm suggesting is that we don't spend all of our time thinking about how to incorporate technology into the classroom, but also carve out some time to think about how our students can connect what they learn in the classroom to their use of technology, inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So spend a little bit of time in this talk thinking about ways to maybe do that. But first I should probably tell you a little bit more about who I am. So as Kim said, on the 1st of September, I started here at Penn, so I'm still the new guy for a couple more weeks probably. And so I'm the manager or managing director of the Price Lab for Digital Humanities, currently over in the museum. Let's see, we've got a slide for that. Yes, so that's our tagline: experiment, collaborate, innovate. Let's see, but before I came to Penn, I was the digital scholarship librarian at UNC Chapel Hill. And before I did that, I did basically the same thing at Emory, working in the library there. I'll say a little bit more about how the Price Lab fits into all of this in a second, but I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about those library jobs. And this part of the talk is kind of easy for me because I'm just going to tell you what I've been up to for the past 5 years. So when I started working in the library at Emory full-time, digital scholarship was primarily thought of in terms of very large and very ambitious and also very expensive projects. There was a lot of talk about how to make digital projects the equivalent of like a manuscript in terms of complexity, but also in terms of prestige, and probably most importantly in terms of tenure and promotion. So those were the big conversations. The big project at the time was this massively important and just massively massive project called the Slave Voyages project. Has anyone heard of this? A couple. So this project was more or less the culmination of one professor's entire career. Dr. David Eltis had spent most of his professional life going around the world trying to find all the records of all of the transatlantic slave voyages. And he had compiled first a database, and then it became a CD-ROM, and so the Slave Voyages project was an attempt to bring all of that online and to make it searchable. Let's see. This was, obviously a really important project for Dr. Eltis, but it was also, and more importantly, a really important project for all of the descendants of enslaved people. This was a deeply meaningful project. So meanwhile in the library, as this thing is being developed and getting attention and winning awards, there was a real worry about how to keep something like this alive and thriving in the long run. The problem with making these really great, really complex digital projects is that they can be kind of tricky to maintain over the years as technology changes. We know pretty much what to do with books. And I guess I'm about to be glib, and I shouldn't be glib about this in this particular floor of this library, but get a book, put it on the shelf, don't let it get too hot or too wet, and we know sort of how they behave. There's no real equivalent to that with technology. We're just not sure what to do. We're working on it, don't worry. The librarians and archivists spend a lot of time thinking about it. Maybe worry a little bit, actually. But so the result of all of this was a dramatic slowdown in the development of new projects, not just at Emory, but it kind of seemed like everywhere. There was a lot more hesitation. And so I'm not a very big fan of overgeneralizations like this graph, but it does seem to capture some of what I was seeing. There's this initial huge amount of interest and excitement about the possibility of digital technology, and then you start getting questions about sustainability, and you start getting questions about how are we going to pay for all of this. So then you fall into the trough of despair or disillusion in this one. So that seemed to be kind of what I was seeing in the digital humanities world and probably elsewhere. When I got to UNC, I found they were also down in the trough. They had also invested early in some pretty big projects, and those projects had turned into real drains on their resources. This just happens as software gets old, and just the internet works differently than the way it worked in 1996, when some of these projects were started. And people just find themselves painted into a technology corner. So as a result, the library was not very interested in attracting new projects at the time. So you might wonder, why did they hire a digital scholarship librarian? Though they didn't have anything quite this complex, they did have a lot of kind of faculty projects. This is, for example, this is a public historian who did a bunch of work on the Blue Ridge Parkway. So she had gathered all of the records she could find and put them all in one place. It's called Driving Through Time. While the library didn't want me running around finding a bunch of these things, they were interested in figuring out ways to connect the library to research assignments. The library has always been a really good partner for these kind of undergraduate research assignments, but there was a sense that some of those assignments needed to be updated. So for example, when I was at UNC, I was the subject liaison for the American history and British history program. That was one of those sort of other duties as assigned parts of your job. So every semester we would get these students who would come into the library and they'd have this assignment to make a photocopy of the front page of 5 newspapers that came out the day they were born. When I was a first-year student in 1994, that project would have been hard, but probably doable at UNC. The collections were huge enough. But in 2016, that assignment just doesn't work. We don't have print collections like that. I wonder if Penn has print collections like that, but UNC certainly did not. A lot of that stuff had just been made digital. And we were still seeing assignments where the professors were telling them, don't use internet sources, while the library is spending thousands and thousands of dollars on licensed internet sources. At the same time, several tools had come on the scene that were relatively easy to use, and they could also help us avoid having to create entirely new digital projects for every class. So, about to go into a couple of examples, but the idea here is, we have these new digital resources, online, digitized collections, and now these new tools that might help us do something with those digital collections. So instead of building a website from scratch like we did for Driving Through Time, tools like Timeline.js, which is it's a magically simple tool. I always feel bad doing workshops about it because it literally takes 10 seconds. It's really easy. So this is this was for a class on the history of adoption in America, and the idea was that every student had to go find 5 important events in the history of adoption in America and add them to this group timeline. So at the end of the year, or the end of the semester, the whole class would have this one online exhibit, or as a timeline. Another good tool, which is now called Cardo. As of like a couple of months ago, it was CartoDB. But in preparing for this, I learned it's now called Cardo. So this is a project. The class was on Sufism in India. So this project, the professor had each of the students find 3 shrines in India and then write a history of the shrine. And then everyone added it to the same map. So then at the end of the semester, they all had this one big group project. Another example is Emeka. My analogy for this is one sort of genre of project that we had a lot at UNC would be classes wanted one of the students to create a physical exhibit somewhere in the archives. And one class did a really good job, and after that, everyone wanted to do a physical exhibit somewhere in the library, and we just ran out of exhibit spaces. Emeka is a way to do that digitally, so you can create an online exhibit digitally, and it's pretty easy. And the other nice thing about it is, if you want it to, it can last longer than a semester. So you can just keep adding exhibits. I actually had to, what we did at UNC was turn off some of the exhibits when the class was over, just for preservation, because we didn't want to get in the business of actually storing these things forever. But a couple of students asked me to turn one back on just because they were going on the job market and wanted to be able to point to something that they had worked on. And they couldn't have done that with a physical exhibit in the same way. So I don't want to do that yet. There we go. Oh, and I just pulled this example. This is one that I just found out about, I guess, this week here at Penn, working with the Muslim Students Association. One advantage of all of these tools is that they are remarkably easy to use, I promise. They really are. And this is really great because, generally speaking, you don't want learning the tool to take up too much of your class time. If you're teaching a history class, you don't want to spend half the class learning technology. However, one of the reasons these tools are so easy to use is because they're designed to limit the choices that users can make. So I just want to go back through. So for example, here's this timeline tool again, and you just scroll through point by point by point, and you look at the timeline. You've probably all seen timelines. One criticism that we would get is, well, that's a particularly Western way of thinking about how time works. What about cyclical time? What if things are happening concurrently? And those are just constraints that you can't really represent in a tool like this. You may have wondered why the map looks like this. You might be able to imagine that finding Sufi shrines in India and putting them on a map is not a politically neutral activity. Place names are not politically neutral. Place borders are not particularly neutral. We had to try to find a map that respected those issues. There happened to be one preloaded map that was this watercolor that sort of got at that. It let us highlight the specific places we're looking at, but not get into the other place issues. But it's not a perfect solution. And that's just another one of those constraints of the tool. This is Emeka again, really great, but it's extremely rigid in the way it wants you to construct an exhibit and the way it organizes information for you. It usually works pretty well for most things, but people always want it to do a little bit more. Maybe a slightly less substantial argument, it always looks kind of just out of the box. It's very difficult to make an Emeka exhibit truly attractive. I think this one looks great. Whoever did it did a great job with the out-of-the-box tools. But that takes some doing. Let's see. Another reason that these tools are so easy to use and freely available, there's a free version of each of these, is that a lot of them also have some kind of business model behind it. Sometimes it's what I think they call freemium. You get X amount of functionality for free, but if you don't want the font to be Comic Sans, then you have to pay extra. You can have some little bit of data storage, but if you want to do something bigger, then you have to pay for a little bit more. That happens. Another thing is a lot of these tools, and Cardo is particularly interested in this business model, is they want your data. So they'll give you the tool to present your data geographically, but then they might claim some right over that data and be able to use it in different ways. And they kind of merge that model with the freemium model when they say you can have X amount of storage space, but you have to make your data freely available, or you can pay extra to keep your data private. That's never really been a huge problem, but you can imagine assignments that would want to visualize sensitive data or data that is under copyright, and something that's that open might not work for what you're trying to do. So I think these are all pretty serious red flags for the kinds of tools we've been talking about. But I don't actually think there are reasons to avoid using these tools. In fact, I think all of these limitations are great opportunities to teach students something about how the internet works and how technology works, and increasingly just how society works. When students use these tools and get frustrated with the limitations or start to notice the built-in biases that are in the tools, they're getting practice at being real critical consumers of technology and of digital content. And they may also get ideas about how to build better tools. They can start to see the problems. One thing that some people worry about it's so easy to make a website or some sort of digital project look great and have absolutely garbage content, but it looks amazing. How can something that looks this amazing be wrong or be flawed? So when the students learn how easy it is to make something look amazing, then maybe it makes it a little bit easier for them to be critical about what they're seeing. And these tools aren't the only things out there that do these tricks with data ownership or try to upsell users. That's just the way the internet works, and the more sort of practice we get at thinking through those issues, I think that's a good thing to learn. And this is also kind of where I get caught up on that concept of the digital native. I don't find that the students are actually much better at technology than I am. They might be a little bit more practiced than I am, but they're often less afraid of it than I am. And that's great, but it can be dangerous. Sometimes you should be paranoid. I think this is particularly true around privacy issues. So when we incorporate these kinds of technologies into our assignments, there's often a temptation to really focus on the project, get that project finished and make it look great. And that's obviously understandable. But I know this sounds really hippy-dippy, but I try to make the assignments about the students and not about the project. So sort of three things about that. I try to focus on helping the students evaluate technologies rather than just using a specific technology. All three of those tools that I showed you, one of them has already changed since I started talking about this. Things are just going to change. Learning how to use the tool isn't terribly helpful. Learning how to evaluate the tool and learn for yourself is maybe more valuable. So that's something to think about. Also, just trying to value the experience over efficiency. I've definitely seen group projects like, okay, well, this student has a background in web design, so she'll be the leader, and so she winds up doing all the work, and none of the other students learn anything. So if there's a way you can construct it so that that doesn't happen. I think been thinking about this one a lot lately, just having these classes and these assignments being a safe place for students to fail. I think that's something that people talk about a lot. It's like, the Silicon Valley talk. If I'm not failing, I haven't been pushing myself. I think it takes an awful lot of privilege to fail in public like that. So if we can make these classroom assignments a place where students can safely fail and give them that experience, I think that could be a really powerful thing for them. So I want to kind of wrap things up and talk a little bit about maybe if you're excited about that, what you can do at Penn. You have an amazing library here and an amazing library staff. Kim's group in particular, but really this whole library seems to be designed for student engagement. There's so many good resources here. And also, I should put in a little plug for the Price Lab. So we do a lot of different things, but one thing we do is we have some funds available for what we call course development. If you would like to incorporate technology into a class, but you're not really sure how to start, or you maybe need some funds to pay for a tool or something like that, come talk to me and we'll figure out if there's a way we can get that taken care of. Let's see. So that's really all I wanted to present, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes next and being with you for the rest of the day. So thank you very much.